Hello, class. I'm going to be building off the presentation Nick gave on the migratory and the conservation efforts that it instigated with part two, other federal laws protecting migratory wildlife. So I'm going to touch on a handful of programs and pieces of legislation that have built off of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to further conservation of migratory birds specifically, and even more specifically, waterfowl in the United States. I have arranged them mostly chronologically in terms of when they became active or were initiated. And I say mostly because in some instances, these programs have been amended over time. Bear with me. I hope this all makes sense and you can see how conservation policies can build upon each other. So first up is the Migratory Bird Conservation Act and the associated commission, which were established 11 years after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, when it was finalized on February 18th, 1929. It was created and authorized to consider and approve areas of land and or water recommended by the Secretary of Interior for purchase or rental to conserve wetlands and related habitat for migratory birds. Since its establishment in 1929, it has protected over 6 million acres of habitat, and primarily through funding, obviously, and that funding is primarily done through the duck stamps and import duties on weapons and ammo. The Commission approves funding for the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And those grants fund public-private collaborative projects to protect large wetlands and associated uplands for migratory birds. And again, I mentioned that I was going to try and do this chronologically, so I've got a timeline here of important pieces of legislation for conservation in the United States, and we'll be highlighting as we go through this list as we go. So I mentioned the federal duck stamp, and while the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission and the Conservation Act were established in 1929, it wasn't until March 16th, 1934 that the duck stamp was established. And the duck stamps must be purchased prior to hunting if you're into hunting waterfowl. And since 1934, it has raised greater than $1.1 billion for conservation. And again, those funds have helped to preserve over 6 million acres of habitat. That's an incredible amount of money. It's also an efficient fundraising technique because 98% of proceeds from these duck stamps directly fund the Migratory Bird Conservation Fund. And again, super efficiently, not only do those funds benefit bird populations, but the habitat improvements of those funds have other ecosystem services like purifying water, aiding in flood control, reducing soil erosion and sedimentation, and just simply providing outdoor recreation opportunities. So very multiple use. Next up is the Bald Eagle Protection Act, and it's the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So I've got both of those species listed, shown here. And again, here's our timeline. That was established on June 8th of 1940. It was then amended in 1962. And then in 1972, there was actually a court case. It was Hetzel versus the United States. And I'll tell that story here very quickly. Richard Hetzel was the defendant. The U.S. was actually prosecuting Mr. Hetzel, and he was charged with violating the Bald Eagle Act because he removed the legs and talons from a dead bald eagle they had found on a national wildlife refuge. He thought that was really cool, as one might do, and he wanted to bring those artifacts, if you will, to a Boy Scout organization. But the original court who heard this established there was no presented evidence that Mr. Hetzel had willfully violated the Bald Eagle Protection Act. So he was fined $1. However, Mr. Hetzel appealed the case and appealed the $1 fee. And the court then reasoned that the Defendants Act occurred prior to the 1972 amendments, and determined that further the amendments being the knowingly take that clause restriction. So they actually rescinded that $1 fine. So he stood on his principles. The act has not changed since the 1972 amendments, and it's a pretty severe act. It carries both civil and criminal penalties, but really the greatest controversy associated with the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is the limitation of use of eagle parts to Native Americans, because Native Americans traditionally may have been using those pieces and parts in ceremonies and whatnot. So only Bureau of Indian Affairs certified tribal members may obtain Indian religious permits under the Protection Act. And that's what I mean here when I say that possession of these pieces and parts is permitted, literally permitted. So over the course of what looks like about 67 years of protections under the Protection Act, the Bald Eagle was successfully delisted from the Threatened and Endangered Species Act on June 28th, 2007. One thing that I do want to note is that this act doesn't provide any protection of habitat, except for the protection of eagle nests, whereas a lot of the other pieces of legislation and programs specifically protect habitat. So moving on, we're jumping from 1940, 1962, and 1972, all the way up to 1986, when there was I think it's fair to say, a crash in waterfowl populations. So by 1985, 53% of wetlands in the contiguous United States and at least 29% of wetlands in Canada had been destroyed. So this led to that crash that I mentioned in waterfowl populations. So they had hit this record low. So there was a concerted effort in 1985 that led to the establishment of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan in May of 1986. Mexico ended up joining on the plan in 1988, actually, but didn't sign until 1994. Since its creation, the plan has been updated several times, notably revised in 2012 and then updated again in 2018, such that it was able to strengthen its foundations, its biological assumptions, expand and redefine its habitat restoration goals, and then also create broader alliances and partnerships with other bird conservation groups. And one thing that I think that is really interesting is that it relies on this migratory bird joint venture approach. So it's thinking like on a continental scale, but it's acting really regionally because the regions have very different ecotones or habitat types. So there are 24 habitat-based joint ventures across Canada, United States, and Mexico that address bird and habitat conservation issues within those specific regional areas. And then there are 3 species-focused joint ventures that all have international scopes. So shortly thereafter, in 1989, on December 13th, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act was established. And this is a program that provides grants to manage migratory birds and their habitats across North America, US, Mexico, and Canada. Since its establishment in 1989, it has provided more than $2 billion to benefit migratory birds and their habitats. And this is something that I really want to call out is the matching funds aspect of the North American Wetland Conservation Act. So while that program on its own has provided $2 billion, its partners have contributed more than $4 billion in that time in matching funds to help protect, restore, and enhance more than 31 million acres of wetlands and associated uplands. So this mechanism of matching funds is a really effective way for the federal government to leverage its money to attract additional investment from state or private entities. And in this case, it's doubled that over the course of the last, 30 some odd years. So again, North American Wetlands Conservation Act stimulates public-private partnerships. That's really important to protect, restore, and manage wetland habitats for not just migratory birds or waterfowl, but any wildlife who utilize those habitats. So again, I might have quickly glossed over this. It's affected more than 3,300 projects, like individual projects, across all 50 states, areas of Canada, and areas of Mexico. And with those 3,300 projects, that includes more than 6,800 different partners, which again include private landowners, private industries, state governments. So they all kind of work together. It's a really inclusive, interesting program. And then those funds are overseen and awarded by a 9-member council who meets periodically. And again, here's our timeline. So there's a lot of action that kind of picks up here between the 1960s and 1990s. So next up, again, kind of a flurry of activity between 1985 to 1986, all the way through the early 90s when we get the Harvest Information Program established on March 19th of 93. So this is another cooperative effort between this time the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies. And what it does is it essentially surveys hunters' harvests after they go out hunting. So if you're not a hunter, this is something that's required by most, if not all, state regulations. And it literally, every hunter has to fill out a form that collects data on, how many days they were out hunting, how many individuals they harvested, how the hunt was, and all that data that's collected is super useful for biologists to then administer subsequent surveys that are used to estimate annual harvest across the country or across different regions or states, and also the number of hunters who are active so that they can make informed decisions on the management of migratory bird populations. So essentially this allows state agencies to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to set the harvest seasons in terms of the duration, dates, make sure that we're not hunting during the wrong times, because as we know, climate change may be affecting how certain migratory species move across the landscape. And it's become extremely beneficial. When it was initially established, it did receive some opposition from hunters and non-government organizations like the National Rifle Association, or NRA, but now it's well received by all parties because the level of effort in participating in the surveys is pretty minimal. And yeah, if you don't partake in the Harvest Information Program, you're not allowed to get your permit or your tags for the following year. Next up is the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, which we'll be touching on somewhat in the readings this week. It was established on July 20th of 2000 And I'll back up. First off, a neotropical bird is a species that breeds in the US or Canada, but spends the non-breeding season in Latin America or the Caribbean. Um, and this act provides grants to benefit those bird species across their life cycle. So it's another program that established a matching grant program that supports, again, public-private partnerships to leverage federal funds. And they carry out interesting or beneficial, noteworthy projects in the United States, Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So it's not just limited to North America. And it has to date funded projects that have helped those neotropical migratory birds across 40 different US states and territories and more than 30 different Latin American and Caribbean countries. So that money has been spread across a wide geographic area. And it's not as well funded as NACA is, but it still has awarded more than $50 million in grants since 2002. And that $50 million has attracted over $190 million in matching funds to the program. So that has enabled this act to improve over 3.7 million acres of habitat. So this matching grants program or programs is a super efficient way to leverage investments. So lastly, I'm going to spend the last few minutes and slides discussing an article titled "The Decline of North American Avifauna," which was published in Science in 2019. And I'm really going to focus on this one graphic, and we're going to go piece by piece between each one of the 4 different sections, right? So this focuses primarily in the avian populations in the United States and North America after 1970. And as you can see in A of the diagram, populations of birds plummeted over the course of those 40 years. And if this went back further, you'd see that in the early 20th century, populations had crashed even before then. And this is all due to, habitat loss, hunting, and in the early 20th century, a lot of trade and sport, which was then regulated more stringently by a number of the different pieces of legislation that I've reviewed and in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that Nick shared earlier. So thankfully, we've passed a lot of that legislation and have been able to conserve these species a lot better, but still, even after a lot of that, we still saw all these, the bird populations crashing. So as we know, a number of different things have been put in place to try and protect against further declines in these populations. And I've highlighted that North American Waterfowl Management Plan that was initially brought up between the United States and Canada in 1985 and established in 1986. And you can see, and I'll back up to the previous slide so you're not just trusting my arrow there, that right there in 1985, 1986, it started to make a turn for the better. So that's the rebound that I'm talking about. And while the Migratory Bird Conservation Act ensured that hunters contributed to long-term conservation and management, it still wasn't on the right trajectory that we were looking for. So this North American Waterfowl Management Plan really helped, specifically with regards to species in wetlands. So the subsequent data collection programs like the Harvest Information Program that I mentioned developed into arguably the best monitoring system in the world for species distributed across a continent. And then the resulting repository of data then, as I mentioned previously, allowed scientists to make scientifically defensible management decisions, that the proof is in the pudding. We're seeing the rebound in those populations. So this is really encouraging to see. But with that being said, take a look at this final side of the graphic. It all worked for wetland species. It worked great for waterfowl species, and that's because there were a lot of these targeted pieces of legislation and programs for waterfowl. And we can see that this Rosenberg study shows us, well, we don't see it, but it's in the article. There's a 56% increase in waterfowl populations since 1970. If you compare this to species in grasslands, which had a 74% decline over the same period, I mean, species in every other biome have decreased except for in wetlands. Why is that? Probably because of all the programs that we put in place, because there are engaged stakeholders with a vested interest in waterfowl populations, because it's a multiple use taxonomic group, we'll say. So the billions of dollars that have been invested in this, in waterfowl and their habitats, is encouraging, because it provides a model for proactive conservation in other habitats, but only if we can activate similar interest groups. So it might be a lot harder to have an interest group that's really interested in Arctic tundra species. But I would say that, kind of to steal a line from Aldo Leopold, we conservationists live in a world of wounds. And, you know, there's one positive and a bunch of negatives, a bunch of wounds that we can see here. And to further in my stealing ways, I'll end with this thought from the Rosenberg article. History shows that conservation action and legislation work. So with that in mind, we need to get active and affect the next big change in wildlife conservation. Pick one of these biomes, pick one of these taxonomic groups. The blueprint is there. Follow it. Push for legislation. Push for conservation action. Activate your interest groups. Get involved with the Audubon Society, something. We can't be only focused on waterfowl moving forward, is what I really want to leave us with, and hopefully encourage you to check out the articles that Nick and I have put together for you guys in the videos, so we can be encouraged by what we've seen in wetlands, but take upon the challenge to apply that in other ecosystems. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.